Welcome to lit.happensse, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicating to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally.
Awesome. So listen to us weekly for episodes where we're going to be unpacking prescriptions. We're going to be providing modules, rubrics, texts, and more by providing clear insights and practical strategies. Be sure to check out our show notes for resources where to find us and other helpful links.
And once on board this journey with us, we will all explore the world of literature. We'll help you achieve your English teaching goals because we are navigating the pages of senior English together.
See you on board. Well, welcome back everyone to lit.happensse. Today we are going to be going into the depths of Module B, the critical study of literature for advanced English. And we are excited about developing, again, a bit of insight for you guys moving into the process, I guess. Yeah, it's a big thing. So welcome, Belle. Again, I'm Adriel. You probably heard in the intro.
Hi, everyone.
We're ready to actually, delve deep into this. I know the other day I spoke quite a bit. I guess it's Belle's turn today. And you guys are going to be in for a whole heap of insight. So how exciting. I guess when we look at the Module B sort of context here, we're looking at this idea of a critical study, aren't we? So the central goal, I guess, for students might be developing a detailed analytical and critical knowledge of substantial literary texts. I guess the question is then, Belle, now what do we mean by a substantial literary text?
Yes, if you look at both rubrics, either the advanced version of Module B, critical study, or the standard of close study, you see that the same term comes up. And it's in the first or second sentence, I think, that idea of that substantial literary text. So really, we're looking at a text that is a complex text. It's really rich. It's probably a text that has merit and acclaim. And this idea that the text is substantial because it's got this rich array of characters and language and style and has real significance in its messaging because of the context that it's tied to. Yeah. So the other thing with that idea of that substantial, if you're doing the advanced, you'd be looking at this idea of the textual integrity. And this idea that the text has integrity and is worthy and is of acclaim and is an iconic text because of the way that all its aspects and features work together to create unity and to emphasize the rich literary nature of the text. And so, and usually those substantial literary texts, they're quite evocative, they're quite thoughtful, they have a lot of insights into human nature, human psyche, and they've probably had some critical reception and critical acclaim as well, which means that often the texts you see there have a real influence on society and like a lasting significance. So when we say substantial literary, that's kind of the basket that I place that in.
Yeah, cool. So we say sort of like these texts would be part of the literary canon per se. And I know I alluded to this in our first introductory episode. A lot of these texts may not seem significant to our students, but when you get into the ins and outs, the intricacies of the text, we start to see some of those sort of substantial, sort of complex, critical makeup of these texts, which make them rich, as you've sort of alluded to. Look, I think that's a fantastic sort of intro into what substantial means. And I guess when we look at substantial, again, you mentioned this idea of complex ideas and issues, and it's not a singular focus. Would you agree? Like when we're looking at
Absolutely. And absolutely. And I think they very deliberately pick these really rich texts so that students have multiple ways in to approach an analysis. So because it's just critical study of a text, it's not like, for example, Module A, textual conversations, where you have to clarify what is meant by a textual conversation and then go through that lens in analysis. The critical study really means that students have the opportunity to make their own interpretations, to create their own unique approaches. So no two essays in this critical study pile will really be the same, I think.
Yeah. No,
and it's like
that's
you
definitely
said,
true.
yeah, and it's like you said, if you're in the advanced course, you'll see that there are some canon texts in the list and some contemporary ones. And if you're in the standard course, there might more likely be contemporary texts, but they're ones that have, when they came out to immense acclaim, like your Truman Show's Curious Incident of the Dog, texts like that.
Yeah, no, exactly right. Good old pattern there.
Yeah.
So I guess you sort of touched on this already now a little bit, and you've alluded to the differences between the advanced and the standard course when it comes to our Mod B unit. So let's delve a little bit further into the rubric, some of the key terms, some of the key points, what teachers have to look out for in regards to key content, and then also the skills. But I'm going to sort of ask you, can we look at like some of the key skills that students will want? So I often sort of look at the key verbs. So we generally start off with like an identify, and then it moves on to like that interpret, and then we go into analysis, and then we go into like an evaluation. So how would you go about those key skills before transitioning into looking at some of the key terms?
Yeah, so when you're looking at the rubrics across advanced and standard, they have a lot of similarities at their base level skills wise. They want a close analysis, okay, or a critical. So if I'm thinking of a close analysis for my standard students, the skills is their ability to read, to interpret, to analyze, to evaluate, to judge, to respond. And I think then the difference with the advanced course is it goes that little bit extra level where it, refers to a critical analysis. So it actually then asks students to have a judgment and an evaluation, not just of what they're reading and their interpretation, but of the evaluation of other perspectives. So they might be, you would be encouraging your advanced students to do critical reading and to access articles, journals that have been written about that text to deepen that lens and that perspective. But ultimately, I think that main goal is, your first level is your engagement with the text. Students have to engage with it. They have to read, they have to interpret, they have to analyze. And then through that, they develop interpretation. Then they develop perspectives. And I think that's where the skills focus is. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I often find like with some of the students, especially in the advanced cohort in the last few years, looking at some of the methods, a lot of students actually neglect those initial skills. So I've gone through a little bit of a process this year where, I've really got them to actually define the verbs, rather than just looking at the HSE glossary as a starting point, in regards to some of those key skills. I really have to get them to understand, well, what does it mean to identify something? What does it mean to then, interpret something? So, for example, the other day in one of my lessons, the interpretation sort of part was, a breakdown of ideas, and you can sort of look at that concept lens in that manner. And then after you sort of build in those skills, I mean, we're looking at simple sort of analysis and then evaluation, which then moves into some of the critical stuff that we need for this unit. But when we look at these verbs, I think sometimes as teachers, we go too fast in terms of teaching some of these skills, and we sort of think, okay, we need to get through X, Y, and Z content. But I think it's very important for us to build that foundation with our students so that they have that foundation. So as they go into, again, the exam, and you'll see in the first paragraph of the Mod B rubric, you'll see, again, it's that student's sort of interpretation of text. It's how they engage with the text. It's asking for that personal voice. And I feel like if they don't have those key skills, we're doing them a disservice. And you're doing yourself a bit of a disservice because you'll get to your drafts later on down the track and it's like, oh, why is this a bit of a summative sort of response? We've got no critical sort of lens. So I think those verbs are very important.
Absolutely, because you're right. If they brush past that, then they're at risk of having a very surface level understanding because they become
Yeah.
quite passive in their engagement with the text.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's definitely a thing that we do have to move on to. But I guess we've covered a bit of the key skills there that we would use as a foundational element in our
Mm-hmm.
teaching pedagogy. Let's move into some of
Mm-hmm.
the key terms and key points, I guess, in this rubric. What are some of the
Yeah.
things that you've identified in regards to the terms, the points, and even the key content? Like, what does this unit entail for not only
Yeah.
yourself as a teacher, but the students as well?
So if you look at the first couple of lines in either rubric, you can see it's got that idea of detailed, analytical, and critical knowledge, understanding, and appreciation. So I think the thing that I often start with my students when I'm doing Module B is I start with this idea of the appreciation of a text.
Yeah.
Because it plays really well with the substantial literary text. So,
Mm.
not only will we look at why is our prescribed text substantial, what makes it so, does it have a claim, was it
Yeah.
very unique, was it deepening some sort of, insight. So not only starting with that, but then also talking about, well, in what ways do we appreciate? Because I even often start with there's some really great little clips and activities that you can do, like on YouTube, where
Yeah.
you get kids to look at like iconic texts, or even fun things. We put up movie posters of these iconic films, and seeing what they can identify. And
Yeah.
it's just to hone in on that concept of what we mean by something that's substantial or iconic, and why it's appreciated.
Yeah.
Like, I don't really care for them. That might cop me a lot of flack, but those damn Marvel movies that everyone's obsessed with, like, okay, well, what is it that's, appreciative of that text, just as a way in for the students? And then you can get into more, classic text, more iconic text. And don't forget that they've spent 7 to 11 looking at substantial text. It's not like you've just
Yeah.
started that in year 12. It's like all of that is in the lead up. So even getting students to go back to that starting point of why was
Yeah.
it substantial? What was so powerful about it? What was evocative? And then, because I know both you and I, do this, we tell the students, you're not going to like everything you read, as in it's not going to be, your cup of tea or the book that you would pick
Yes.
up. Okay.
Yep.
But it's about appreciating and having that depth of
100%.
connection. Yeah, that, okay, I can take something from that. I don't have to love the text. I don't have to love every aspect, but there's got to be a nugget of wisdom in there. And there will
Yeah.
be, because that's why these texts have been selected and put on
Yeah.
that list,
Yeah. I love that. I love that sort of idea. It's about appreciating good literature when you see it, isn't it? And
That's
I
it.
think that's sort of
Yeah,
one of the things that we really gain from this unit in particular. And
yeah,
we sort of
absolutely.
look at that enthusiasm as the teacher. Again, I harp on this quite a bit. If we're not enthusiastic about what we're teaching, how can you
Why would
expect
they
the
care?
students? Exactly.
100%.
Exactly.
100%.
Uh,
And you're
yeah.
laying
So,
those foundational skills even from reading to write, that idea of, like you just said,
hmm,
what does a good text look like? What does it look like?
yeah.
What does it sound like? What does it feel like?
Yeah, that's 100% correct in regards to. I like how you referenced the reading to write unit.
Mm.
It's very much a
You,
foundational sort of unit in
yeah,
the
if you
11.
just, yeah, as soon as those words came out of your mind, your mouth, I thought, well, yeah, that's right. Because reading to write is all about, well,
Yeah,
what makes something, rich and complex and well crafted. And, all those
yeah,
skills lay the foundation to give your students the tools and the power to actively interpret the text themselves. Like, yes, you're going to
yeah,
analyze together. You're going to do all those things. But at the
yeah,
same time, if the students don't actually access it on their own and engage on their own, then they're going to struggle to find a personal interpretation.
yeah. No, exactly right. So it looks like we've covered quite a few of the things in regards to some of those key points and some key content. Just one thing with the key content, when we're looking
Yeah.
at like these texts, how would you approach I guess the study? Do you look at it through like a thematic lens? Do you look at it through I like to use the word conceptual lens. So we're looking like the
Yeah.
holistic sort of learning. But then
Yeah.
obviously being a critical study, how do you sort of delve into breaking down the complexities of that concept?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think the way that you always start that is with purpose, audience, and context. Like,
Yeah.
I find that really needs to be narrowed down, particularly if it's not a text that is traditionally canon and familiar. Like I think of Ishiguro's Artists of the Floating World, right?
Yeah.
Until I taught the text, I had never read that text. I knew that it was acclaimed, but I had never accessed it myself. So I think the starting point, especially because a text like that has a very different set of perspectives. It's a very cultural lens, and it's got a very specific time frame that's, you know, quite distant from our students and, you know, even you and I. So
Yeah.
I think that the way to do that is always starting with like who is the author, what was their intent, you know, what is their purpose, because that's, I think, going to lend itself well also to the text reception and how it was received in its time. So usually I find with these texts it's because they have this appreciation because of what the author has crafted. So
that's great.
I find
I like this.
narrowing down.
Yeah, I like that sort of idea. It's like this idea of appreciation is definitely inherent when it comes to this module as well. And you've sort of hit the nail on the head there, where we are looking at some of that authorial intent. We're looking at, again, we mentioned this last episode, this idea of didactic intent, which is, you know,
that's
essential,
right.
isn't it?
That's right, and that's where. Sorry.
No, you're right. When it comes to like that text composition and reception, we get a bit too excited, don't we?
We do. We
Talking
just
about
could
this
talk
stuff
forever. But you're right, because that's another way that I get into. So, what are the key concepts? Is trying to, with the students, interpret that didactic intent. Okay, like this is what they wanted to achieve. These were the key ideas, and you can start off with themes to get you going, but ultimately, what are they trying to say message wise? What is their didactic intent, or what messaging are they trying to get across, or what are they trying to, you know, teach or advocate? And I find once you start that, then you get a bit of a scope for approaches and concepts. Like if you're looking at artists, you're looking at, you know, that idea of, you know, human culpability. You know, you might be looking at the influences of dogma, and you might be looking at how we as humans all want to paint ourselves in the best light, or how we want to reconcile with a life we've lived. So those are things that you start to identify once you've honed in on that purpose, audience, context, and then you start to let the story tell you what the messaging is when you're looking closely at you know, then the specifics in there.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. So you sort of covered a little bit here on how you would introduce the text, which captivates the interest. Do you want to just sort of expand on that a little bit more as you do that? Because like we were talking about, you know, you've covered context, getting them into, you know, some of the intricacies of how the text is developed. But let's say you've got like a student who's like, Miss, I don't want to read Ishiguro's Artist of the Floating World. I mean, I've had this issue myself. Where it's like at the end of the year, they're just like, yes, sir, I only read like half of it. I'm like, well, it's reflective in your results,
absolutely.
isn't it? Like,
that's right. Yeah, okay. So some strategies then maybe might be you might actually assign certain research projects. I find documentaries really useful. Like when I'm doing Ishiguro's Artist, I find some Pearl Harbor documentaries that have the perspectives of both the American and the Japanese soldiers. And just that real world lens, I think, brings students a bit closer to, okay, this narrative, yes, it's a story and it's fiction, or, you know, whatever your text might be, or if it's poetry, whatever, but it's grounded in reality. It's grounded in being human. And even that, getting students to debate certain topics. So if you already know some themes or some concepts that you might be covering, have students have a, you know, respectful but, you know, robust debate about these ideas, about you know, what they think, what, you know, what does it mean to be culpable? If you don't physically harm but you were a bystander, did you still create harm? You know, just having these little ins, I think, are some activities, some strategies.
So making it like relatable, I guess, to their contemporary world.
Very much so. If they can't connect, it's going to be very hard for them to get engaged enough to have then a close reading of the text.
And you've just mentioned this idea of close reading and I guess analysis. So what do we mean by close reading and analysis when it comes to our engagement with this text?
Yeah. Well, when you're close reading, you're really diving into, the nitty gritty of the text. So if you're doing that advanced course, you could be referring to this idea of that textual integrity, where there's that unity between the messaging, the context, the ideas, and the language. So even when you start off, you might even just start off the first couple of pages or the first poem, whatever your works is, or the first scene. And even just getting the students to note down for themselves, what do they see in terms of the construction? So what is the form of the text? What is the genre? How is the text type playing out? If this is a film, what cinematic techniques are standing out? Where's the style? Is there a postmodern interpretation or lens? So when you start with that, then they can start thinking, okay, well, content-wise, what's happening? Who are we introduced to? What moral dilemmas are being brought up? And then language, what do they identify in terms of techniques? I think the close reading is just making sure that students are not just reading for the sake of reading, like, oh yeah, I read it, but did you really think about it while you read it? Did you really try and take note of things that stood out? And then students who I find don't particularly enjoy this aspect, I say to them, you don't necessarily need to annotate the entirety of the page. That skill can develop, but just going gut feel evocatively, what stands out. Like, how we all can feel like, I know I've done it with students and they say, yeah, I can tell that's an important quote, or I can tell that something important has happened. I'm just not sure yet why and how. So going with that gut feeling to allow that close reading. And even like I tell my students, they can keep a journal, or even as teachers. I often, when I'm, because we're always lifelong learners, aren't we? So every time 100%. You do the text, you get something new out of it, right? So I always make sure that whatever new insight or new perspective, I write it down, and then I turn that into a question, or ask your students to, if they have questions about what they've read in that close reading, to write down that question, a journaling, have an opportunity where they have an open discussion and allow the students to clarify with each other what they've read in that close reading, because you will then get to the analysis. You will get to the, let's look at these key sections. Let's create a table. Let's dissect this quote. Like, you will get there. But I think if the students are also engaging on that close reading, that will help. And then when you get to that analysis, you'll be able to get the analysis more easily, because students have already engaged in discussion. They've already identified some sections that they think is worthy. They've looked at what devices the author might have used.
I completely agree with that. And I like that idea of the journaling. I often have this sort of thing with my students where I say to them, well, we said this idea that there's no silly questions. So at the end of the lesson, I'll try and say at the back of your book or within your pages, have 5 questions to ask me if you didn't understand things, especially when it comes to a critical study. It makes me as a teacher sort of engage with what my students are thinking, gets me to understand where they're at.
You're right. What they're interpreting, what direction maybe you will take as the teacher to support their approach. That's awesome.
Exactly. And it's often hard. It's like, trying to draw water from a rock sometimes with these students, but it's a nice sort of less confronting way where you get them to write some questions down, maybe shoot you an email after class saying, hey, sir, I didn't get this. If they're really worried, I generally encourage them to ask the same question in class, because I guarantee you there'll be 5, 6 other kids that will be thinking the same thing. But, we work in our own sort of pedagogy there. But I guess you've sort of covered, you've covered a little bit of, how to encourage and engage them in that close reading and analysis. But we'll move on to like why it is important that we make the focus about text appreciation, especially in this unit. What is this idea of text appreciation? Again, what is the importance of it in the context of our study and our teaching as well of this unit? What do you think?
Well, I think if they're able to appreciate the text, then it means that they've engaged meaningfully, not in a passive way. They've engaged meaningfully, and that they've made connections So
Mm.
they've connected themselves to some sort of aspect or feature or experience of the text, which then helps them to determine what they think the text is trying to say,
Yeah.
and that then lends itself to insights and perspectives and interpretations, and
Yeah.
ultimately once they start having I think big concept or big picture, this is what this text is trying to express to all of us
Mm.
reading it. That's
Mm.
when then the thesis starts to come forth. And
Yeah.
students, I think, don't realize that's once you work out, this is what I'm trying to say about the text, this is what I've
Yeah.
understood, appreciated, what I find as substantial, that then
Yeah.
becomes the thesis that they will use to drive their analysis and their
Yeah.
responses eventually.
Yeah, 100%. I like that idea of them developing their own thesis. They make it personal to their own voice. And you sort of covered there that
Yeah.
textual interpretation, which then guides their response when it comes to the essay that they will inevitably be writing. So I guess one of the things that, we'll look at in terms of personal interpretation and the response, how can you foster that deeper insight for the students? What are some of the skills that you've used in the classroom?
Yeah, I think sentence stems are really awesome, or just like sentence starters. So I
Mm.
like to even take like those key terms that we discussed in the rubric that are really like interpretive or response based. I
Yeah.
tend to just use those as a starting point to let students finish that off in their own words, and then rephrase and interpret that.
Yep.
Doing it as a whole class in a discussion works really nicely too.
Yeah.
So even if you start with, well, here were some of the themes. Okay, so if this theme is in here and you were interested in that, what's a more conceptual outlook of this idea? Like if we were turning this theme that we see into a sort of message that's occurring in the novel, how can we
Yeah.
develop that? And then allowing
Yeah.
students that opportunity to workshop. But I think it depends on the classes. Sometimes and the students. Sometimes I find I have students, they're really keen to just get going and do their thesis and get into, like, they know, some kids, it clicks straight away.
Yeah.
This is what I like about this text. This is what I appreciate. And that's my lane and I'm going for it, But some students sometimes need a bit of time to develop that. So the class discussion really is important there. And even as a teacher, modeling it. So if I would pick one theme, or I would pick one theme and turn it into a concept, or start with the concept and how do we see that as interpreted, as reflected, within the text. Yeah.
I would say
as
teachers, like you just mentioned there, you'd grab your pen or your texter out on the board, get them to,
that's it.
really engage with this sort of stuff. And again, I think that's good pedagogy
Mind maps.
as well.
I love a good mind map. That's my favorite.
I think it's great pedagogy on the part of the teacher as well, because it shows the students that you are engaging with the text and the study as well, rather than, hey, I want you to go out and just write a thesis statement, and you've provided no guided practice, no sort of development there. I think
as much as we'd love students to do that, we got to think about our cohort, and they change from year to year and they change from school to school. So you've got to work with, the skills and develop them accordingly.
And again, like we just sort of spoke about there, the busyness of the term dictates a lot of our decisions, and sometimes we just think we need to get through the content. Again, some of the things that I would encourage teachers to look at are some of the planning things that we have developed for you guys in regards to this, to hopefully help alleviate some of the stresses as to, oh my goodness, like, what do I have to go through to get X, Y, and Z done before the end of the term? Hopefully some of the things that we are producing for you guys will definitely help you along the way. No, that's definitely a great way to sort of look at it. And you've provided some great insight as to how we would actually get the students to foster this personal interpretation. So moving on to the next little part, I guess another key aspect of Mod B is appreciating the aesthetic nature and the imaginative aspects of the text. So again, we go back to that personal interpretation and the personal sort of voice, but how do you get your students to express their views creatively?
Yeah, I think what we really need to do, and it's hard to, I know it's so hard to find time in a critical study to do this, but at least giving them a few opportunities to actually compose their own poems or their own texts that are inspired by what they're reading. And that's very Module C craft of writing-esque, which I know we haven't done an ep on yet, but we'll get there. But this idea in going back to that idea of an aesthetic, of a style, of a way of writing, and getting students to play around with that. So, you know, if let's say illusion was a very big aspect of, you know, the mod B text that you're doing with your students, getting them to play around with that illusion and put it into a new context. You know? If it's like the theme or the concept and the idea, again, getting them to put it into a new context, getting them to move it into a different text type, because I think then students will appreciate like the art form of creating, and they'll be able to see that sense of aesthetic, you know, that real quality, the style, the way that language, the choice of technique. Even I think with this one, what's really handy is to have them create some visual representations as well. And even some art, you know, that there are, you know, and there's always going to be students go, I can't draw. And I say to them, I don't either. Look at my stick figures on the board. But, you know, it's not necessarily about being, you know, the best artist. It's about, can you translate those ideas into a new format? Because that's also going to consolidate, I say to them, that's going to consolidate that understanding as well. You know, if you have a group of students that are game and that are a bit more, you know, kinesthetic and they like to learn with their body, then maybe they perform, you know, a scene or a moment, or maybe they, you know, interpret the character, you know, physically. So there are ways, I think, to have creative fun where it's not just sit down, copy the note. Like there's always a place for that, right off the board, copy the note. But sometimes these little, especially if you see that your students are not quite engaging, these little activities might actually encourage that engagement as well, I think, and consolidate their close reading, which will then lend itself to analysis after the fact.
Definitely. And I guess you're sort of talking about a bit of composition here. I guess we then move on to like the essay here. So, you know, students have to be expressing their ideas, their complex ideas in a precise manner, and obviously have that cohesive nature to their writing. How do you help them with their draft process in order to refine and I guess give them that feedback, feed forward method? What are some of the things that you sort of use with your students as a final sort of way of looking at this unit?
Yeah, definitely. I like to start with a group kind of whole class brainstorm and discussion so that I can talk students through an approach or a thesis. I tend to start with the rubric first. So even if I pull out, you know, and we know that, you know, the questions come from the rubric, and in Module B, sometimes they're very explicitly worded to the rubric, and sometimes there's the rubric and, you know, here's a particular concept we want them to work with in the essay as well. But starting with, you know, a rubric and developing a thesis out of that, and then actually using past HSC questions. I find it really useful to not only model how to make a thesis, but to show students in the class all the different approaches that could be had for that one question. Because I think sometimes students feel worried, like, but, you know, if I'm saying something different, like, isn't that bad? Shouldn't like we all be interpreting the same way? And so I think when you physically can get on the board and show them those different approaches and breakdowns, they'll actually start to see how not moldable, but like how much that their concept and idea can lend itself to all the different questions. You know.
I agree.
I like also to give them time to workshop the structuring of their ideas. You know, sometimes I'll print them like a bit of a concept mapped, and I'll try and produce that for the little resource that will attach a PDF copy. But getting them to visualize where their idea is going, because that will also help make sure that their thesis is sustained, right? Like we're all guilty of it, even as students ourselves. Some of us, maybe the first half of our essay was really good and then it fell off, or the first half was rocky and then the second half it really became more sustained. So getting them to plan out that approach really makes sure that it's all solidified and the response has unity, just like the text has unity.
I like that.
I mean, and then even things like analysis tables, getting the students to write consistently across the term in a short paragraph response, even if after every lesson, or if you can't every lesson, at the end of the week, throw them one really little simple revision question from what they've like analyzed, or even what they've read, or what approach you discussed, or what they liked from the text, and just get them to practice that writing, because that will give them, I think, their confidence in their personal perspective.
I like this idea, because teachers will probably ask, well, I've given these tasks, but the students don't do it. And I figured recently, because, I've been there, and you get frustrated with the lack of responses sometimes, but give them an explicit focus. Hey, we're looking at this today, this idea. I just want like a thesis sentence, or I want 3 or 4 thesis statements. You might provide them with a few good ones, and then get them to look at, why is this good, or why is this body paragraph good? So there's a little bit of work on your part, but I guess this is the idea that we're trying to facilitate. We need to be engaged with our texts, with our teaching, in order for the students to be engaged. And it's definitely something that will encourage them to then focus on the clarity and the cohesiveness of their response if you're doing these little writing tasks.
That's
along
right.
the way.
And they can do that in pairs as well, or in small groups. If you have a lot of resistance to, like, they're not feeling as confident yet to get their writing, let them do it in pairs or threes. Like, let them consolidate together and produce a response, and then use that as a resource for the class. Tell them we're all going to have a go. We're all going to do a different one, and then we're going to collate them. We're going to go through and see what we think and discuss, and I guess springboard off of that. Because peer review sessions, having students with their good friend of their choice actually read their paragraph and discuss, this is what I think. That's really cool. I engage with that too. Even like 2 stars and a wish, or something similar to that, 2 things they did great. One suggestion of, maybe you could look at this part in the novel to support what you're saying. Or, remember this quote that we looked at last week? That was really great. So encouraging students to not only give constructive criticism, but receive it. Because if they're not confident in doing that, they're not going to show you drafts, are they?
No, 100%. Yeah. So there's a few sort of practical skills that we've got for Mod B here. And, we've had a bit of a chat now regarding Module B. We will obviously get into some of the texts as we continue this journey, and we'll go into some sort of explicit detail as to how we would teach specific things. But hoping you guys are enjoying listening to the little bit of conversations from your everyday teachers here. We are still teaching. We are still there with you guys, and we're enjoying this journey as well. So we'll look forward to sort of collaborating more and getting stuff out there for you guys, especially when it is stressful. So keep an eye out. I'd encourage you guys to like, subscribe, and just follow our journey as well. Because like I said, we're excited to be hopefully putting in to the great profession that is teaching, and hopefully truly make teaching enjoyable for everyone again as well, especially in this day and age. So
absolutely. We've got a YouTube page as well.
So we'll put the links up. We'll put the links up towards in our comments, and give us a follow, give us a like, and watch the videos with Belle's great content. She's got some excellent stuff up there, breaking things down. But look, thanks guys for listening and tuning in, and we will see you in the next podcast.